Welcome back to the KRUSE Elite Podcast. What's up, Tony?
What's up, Taylor?
How are you?
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Is there a sport or a more traditional training modality that you feel like utilizes the most kind of applied neuro just naturally?
Man, that's tough. So my mind immediately goes to sports that are incredibly reactive, that require like really, really good vision and vestibular skills.
It's like paddle sports or something, or
so like racket, right? Is that what you mean? Like a racket? Yeah. So racket type sports for sure could certainly fit in there. So could any type of combative sport.
Sure.
Especially where there's striking. And then also racing sports like alpine ski racing cars. It's kind of an interesting one to think about, but if you don't have a good visual system, you can't do that.
Right.
Like it's just literally that. Like it's interesting because there's a lot of sports where if you don't have a great visual system, you can compensate for it because of the high level of proprioception that is needed. So like for me, thinking about myself as an athlete, I do reasonably well with wrestling and jujitsu, and like there's a high level of proprioception that's needed for those types of sports.
Right.
And I don't have the best vision. Like I wear corrective lenses. I've been working through different visual deficits since the time I started learning that you could have a visual deficit. And I still have some of those things present in terms of like my visual system I have like stamina issues related to my eyes. And, going back to as long as I can remember really like being in school and stuff. And, you're told you have whatever learning challenges and stuff. A lot of times you're being told that, but you actually have vision issues. In my case, I had vision issues. I was not good at ball sports growing up. They were very frustrating for me and I avoided them. And I transitioned into wrestling and it was like amazing for me because instead of needing to worry about, balls flying at me and lots of different players on the field and kind of that was very chaotic for me, I was able to have my threats right in front of me. And then I could put my hands on a person, grab them, and use my proprioception, which was really good. And it kind of made up for the fact that I didn't have excellent visual skills. So there's definitely, it's cool to run the activities through the filter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But yeah, for me, it's like, okay, I immediately think of sports that require excellent vision, and some of those racing sports really come to mind. Anything that's very reactive, and you're reacting based on visual input.
Also vestibular input, right? If you're changing direction quickly, you're cutting even like the force of a turn on a racetrack or skiing. Yeah,
right. With skiing, you have to be really accurate in terms of the line that you take, and you have so many different forces working against you, right? Because of the speed that you're traveling. And then of course you've got ground reaction forces happening from a uneven surface, right? As an alpine ski racer. So there's a lot to deal with that you don't really know those things exist if you have not experienced that kind of activity. But yeah, without a good vestibular system, it's going to be hard to calculate, how are you going to approach your turn, let's say, and deal with all of those forces at the same time you're dealing with gravity. And that's really what the vestibular system is. It's like a compass that helps you understand where you are in space, which way you're going, and how to deal with gravity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for humoring me. I think it's great that you're thinking about like all the sensory stimulus, and then you're thinking about reacting to it, and you're thinking about movement. And it's like, these are all the things that you're training to just tie everything together and make your brain function better.
Yeah.
So Yeah, you can kind of reverse engineer it almost.
Totally. And I do this a lot. I just kind of run things through my filter in my mind as I'm thinking of, seeing different sports and stuff. One of the funny things that I picked up on was that there are a lot of great martial artists, particularly jujitsu practitioners, when I watch jujitsu, that wear glasses. And some of them wear like pretty darn thick glasses. And when I see that, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this guy's literally blind without his glasses. Those things are so thick, and yet this person I'm actually thinking of is one of the best, if not the best, at least in his weight category in the world. And when he doesn't have his glasses on, he's like squinting and can't even see the scoreboard. And I'm sort of chuckling to myself. I'm like, that's funny. Like jujitsu is so proprioceptive, and certainly a good visual system helps you, because jujitsu is all about pattern recognition. But if you don't have a great visual system to recognize those patterns, you're doing it with sense, right? Tactile sense. And yeah, so it's just interesting. It goes to show you that even high level athletes, depending on their sport and the requirements for it, can have these different limiting senses, if you will, but then make up for it drastically with other things that they're really good at.
Yeah. I think at the highest levels, it's almost like your anatomy and maybe perhaps neuroanatomy selects you for the sport and not the other way around, right?
Yeah,
it's like you look at like the speed skaters, and they all have a very similar body type, and you look at like marathon runners, and they all have a similar body type, and it's football players, and it's like, oh yeah, these people are all like, it's like they're designed for this specific mix of attributes.
Right. And the sport can literally, like, you can reach a point where your career is basically coming to an end because you are missing one of the most important features that is needed neurologically for a sport. And that's in a lot of times that's what we're experiencing when our athletic careers kind of come to an end. Us sort of, non-professional athletes, but you'll even see it at the higher levels. Someone who's really trying to make it, right? They're trying to make it. They're really close. They're on the heels of the best, and they need that extra advantage, and they're missing fundamental things that the highest level athletes have. A lot of it comes down to what's going on with your eyes.
I always thought that the stereotype of jiu-jitsu practitioners being kind of like more cerebral and like, it's because it's like chess, it's like they're making a move and you're making a counter move and they're making a counter move, and you're thinking about these patterns and all that. It turns out we think they're smart just because they all wear glasses.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice, man. Well, we got a pretty good episode queued up today. A couple episodes back, you mentioned this thing called the 8 levels.
Right.
And I'm just sort of excited to get into it because in all of the hours of neuro that we've discussed on here, we haven't really talked about that. And it seems kind of like the key ingredient to diagnosing someone's potential neuro issues, right?
Right.
So yeah, I thought we would do a full episode on the 8 levels and just have you walk us through that process.
Yeah, it sounds great. So yeah, this is big for, the health and movement professionals, and certainly our students who are going to listen to this, because the 8 levels is the framework that our entire curriculum is based around. It is literally the anatomy that supports all of the basic lessons that we teach. So for example, one of the things I teach at fundamental level, like in our free master class, is this idea that the nervous system does 3 things. It takes in information from the outside world. It then decides what the information means, and this is sort of the processing part, and then decides what it's going to do with that information. And then the third part there is the actual outcome of that, which is the output. So there's input, decision-making, output. And this is the loop that we're always talking about that's very fundamental in terms of the human nervous system. Like, this is what the human nervous system is designed to do. Take in the information from the outside world, figure out what it means, what to do with it, and then create an output. And, the outputs can be so many different things. We're usually talking about those outputs as movement, right? Or pain, right? Because those are the two things that come up the most in terms of people's goals, right? Is improving their quality of movement and decreasing the pain that they experience. But there's lots of other things that kind of fall under the umbrella of output. You could put almost anything in there. It could be more specific qualities of movement, whether it's stability or balance. It could also be things like blood pressure. It could even be things like anxiety or depression. So there's lots of possibilities there. But you've got this basic lesson that we're constantly teaching, this input, decision making, output loop. And the 8 levels is literally the anatomy that supports that, right? Because it's much more complex than input, decision making, output. So this is something that we're bringing up a lot, to our students, especially in our advanced course, because the 8 levels is essentially a thinking model. And I want to make sure people know, like, I did not create it. Like, it's not, this is neuro-anatomy. And to be honest, in sort of doing some research on where it originally came from, it's a little blurry at the moment as far as like who gets credit for designing this idea, because I think it originated as the 7 levels. Mm-hmm. And people have sort of taken it and created their own interpretation of it. And the interpretation that I was exposed to was from early on in my Z Health education. And Dr. Cobb, who is the creator of Z Health, had taken it, kind of put his spin or interpretation on it, and it kind of evolved into what is the 8 levels. And so that's kind of where my experience in education comes, is the 8 levels. And I think that this idea of the 8 levels has pretty strong roots just coming from the functional neurology world, which is essentially where applied neurology happens under this name, functional neurology, at more of a clinical level, right? This is literally a doctorate kind of program that you could pursue if you wanted to go that direction. So we get a lot of our inspiration, ideas, and tool sets coming from the research that's happening in functional neurology. So we've got this 8 levels that informs everything that we do. And it essentially is showing us where things can go right and where things can go wrong in the human nervous system. And we can essentially use it as a thinking model or a filter to try to figure out what is the highest priority areas to target with any given concern, be it, for us, a movement problem or a pain issue. There's going to be 8 levels to every movement problem. There's going to be 8 levels to every pain problem. And that's why this is so interesting, is because we typically look at least the industry typically looks at a pain issue in a very isolated nature, right? Your knee hurts, must be a mechanical problem with the knee. That's basically as far as anyone goes. Like, when you look at everything, and sure, there's plenty of people out there and different methodologies that go further than that. But realistically, as a whole, when you look at the whole industry, if your knee hurts, you're going to get told that you have a mechanical problem with your knee. And knowing that movement comes from the brain, and knowing that pain is a construct of the brain, we have to know how to think deeper. And the 8 levels allows us to do that. So here are the 8 levels. Okay, and we'll kind of break it down a little bit more from here, but this all begins at what would be considered the receptor level. So if you were writing down these 8 levels on a piece of paper, the first one would be receptor. And receptor, just kind of give like really brief overview of each of the levels, but with receptors, you can think about what's happening. I think we'll keep it at the skin level to keep it simple. There's other receptor. I mean, you could call the eyes receptors, right? You could call the vestibular system receptors, and they are, right? They have receptors, but to keep it kind of simple, we're going to think about what's happening at the receptor level as what is happening at the level of the tissue. So think about the skin, right? And we can think about tendons and ligaments and nerve fibers that live deep within the joint capsules. But receptors are nerve endings. Okay, that's what they are. They're nerve endings. And we need to be able to test the function, the health and function of those nerve endings, because that is one of the primary ways that you're sensing the world, right? The external world. It's also a primary way that you're understanding what's happening mechanically as you move, like think proprioception. Those nerve endings become sensitized by different kinds of mechanical force as you move, be it nerve endings at the skin level, the connective tissues, joints, ligaments, tendons. Okay, so that's receptor.
It's like touch or movement,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And it can be, it's different types of touch, right? And that's why we have tools to test these different receptor types.
Right.
So we just did an episode on the neurology of touch, right? And we talked in a pretty detailed way about assessing the skin and assessing these receptors and how we have to do that in different ways because there are different types of receptors that sense different sensations. There's also different spinal tracts in which that specific information travels along. So we need to know the differences so that we can test the different receptors, which essentially is also partly a way to be testing those spinal tracts. So that's like when we talked about the difference between testing warm and cool sensations and crude touch and even uncomfortable things like the pinprick test that we discussed, where you're kind of stabbing somebody's skin in creating a little bit of discomfort. We talked about those sensations. We also talked about like light touch and 2-point discrimination and even vibration. So the reason we have those categories of testing is because we're looking at different receptors and we're also testing the different spinal tracts. Okay, so that's receptor level. The next level up would be a peripheral nerve. Okay, so all that information that's coming in from the tissues via those nerve fibers has to have a way to travel. And that's where our peripheral nerves come into play. So we need to be able to test the receptor, test the peripheral nerves, and as you go deeper into peripheral nerves, you learn which nerves supply which muscles and which nerves supply which parts of the skin. And we will have both sensory and motor nerves. So that means a peripheral nerve supplies both muscles, so for movement, and then also a certain portion of the skin for sensation. Some nerves are motor only, some nerves are sensory only, and then we have the combination. Yeah.
So with peripheral nerves, just kind of as like a working definition, these wouldn't be spinal nerves. These would be like smaller nerves that are outside, like in the limbs or in the fingers. Or
yeah, think in the limbs. Yeah. And
Okay.
I guess they're not even small, right? Because think about like the sciatic nerve, right? So the sciatic nerve and then its branches, right? Because it'll branch off as you get further away from the midline. Okay, that's a pretty big nerve. So yeah, just think in the periphery, in the limbs is where kind of where we're zooming in when we say peripheral nerve.
Got it.
And so we have tools for assessing peripheral nerves, right? And some of those sensory tools that we already discussed are part of the assessment for a peripheral nerve. For example, if I do a sensory test on the bottom of somebody's foot and I compare sensation on the right foot versus the left foot, like, okay, client, can you feel this versus this? And then they tell me, you know what? On the left bottom side of my foot, it felt a little dull. It didn't feel the same as when you swiped the brush on my right foot. And so that's a sensory test that is telling you that they have decreased sensation on the left side. Technically, that could be happening because there is a peripheral nerve issue. So it's you could be thinking about it through just receptors, but then you can advance your thinking by going, well, what's the next level up? I wonder if they're having a problem with a peripheral nerve. And then you think about, well, where am I finding the sensory deficit? And if you look at a little map that you can Google up on peripheral nerve distributions, both motor ones and sensory ones, you can see nice color-coded graphics that show you that the bottom portion of the foot, the sole of the foot, would be supplied by the tibial branch of the sciatic nerve. So in knowing that you're running a sensory test on the bottom of the foot, that might make you think about the tibial nerve. So if there's a nerve issue, peripheral nerve issue, perhaps that sensory problem is a reflection of that, right? So that's one idea, behind the thinking with peripheral nerves. Of course, we can have other issues going on with peripheral nerves, like actual entrapment of the nerve itself, right? Where maybe nerves are not gliding appropriately through underlying tissues, or there's been an injury of some kind at some point and there's restriction at the level of the nerve, or maybe it's just a perceived thing, right? Maybe it's literally just perceived by the brain that there is some kind of issue going on with the nerve. So all the more reason to know how to test each of the peripheral nerves that we can target, because that gives us, again, a lot of information. Yeah. Because those are like little highways, little roadways back to the spinal cord.
So I imagine this conversation will come there. This question will sort of come up at every jump in the levels. But let's say like someone has some sort of pain or issue at the bottom of their foot.
Yep.
How would you know that it's peripheral, that there might be a peripheral issue versus a receptor issue at the bottom of the foot?
Sure. You would go by history and you would go by testing. And that's typically how we approach everything. So let's say the person actually has had an injury, that has affected the bottom of their foot. That certainly would give us some insight into why they might have a receptor issue there. Maybe they've had a long-term pain in that area from like plantar fasciitis. And perhaps that area has become very nociceptively active because they've been in chronic pain for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? And maybe that nociception is needs some assistance in terms of kind of being turned down, if you will. So people will tell you things in their history that will help you fast track what might be going on in terms of the 8 levels. They'll give you kind of keywords, which is why we talk a lot of history in our courses, because you have to know how to hear those things and then kind of translate them. Because, the client uses their own words and you kind of have to translate a little bit. But yeah, so it's always going to be history and testing. And so history will always prompt your testing. So somebody might tell you those things and you go, you know what, I should probably test the bottom of your foot. And then maybe you start figuring out more nuanced things about those receptors. Like, well, it appears that they don't have any sensory issues with 2-point discrimination in light touch, but I am seeing that they're having a little bit of a challenging time with this pinprick test. And that information is, again, coming back to those like specific sensations that tell you information about specific sensory pathways. Now you're starting to get more clues as to what pathway actually has the existing issue from a sensory perspective. Yeah.
And from a high level, you're kind of never sure until you run a battery of tests like this, right?
Yeah. And let me say this is important. I'm never sure ever, like ever. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's fun to tell people you're sure. Like I could tell people I'm sure, but the truth is I'm never sure. Everything that we do at this level is based on function. We listen to a person's history and we run tests, and then we see what the outcome of that is. And that's really all we can do, right? Because I don't have technology that goes deep enough, for me to understand what's really happening structurally in a person's brain. I don't know what's happening long term as we even provide training, what's happening structurally. I'm okay with that. I don't need to know, basically, but I need to be accurate enough with my interpretation of history and assessments to make the right training decisions and then get people doing the right stuff. And it's always their functional outcomes, right? And their experience and how they're moving through the world and how they're feeling, that to me really is the ultimate, right? It's like, okay, this is really the goal, right? So we've covered receptor, we've covered peripheral nerve, and now the next one is spinal cord. Okay, so we said that whatever happens at the level of the tissue, be it a sensation that's happening on the skin or some sort of proprioceptive activity that, our brain's getting information from mechanically what's happening in a joint as we move, that information sensitizes these nerve fibers. Then that information travels a peripheral nerve, and kind of the first checkpoint on its way to the brain, or I should say, yeah, it's a checkpoint, right? It's the spinal cord, right? Because all those peripheral nerves originate from different levels of the spinal cord. So this is an important one because we want all sensory input that's coming in from the outside world to get to the right places in the time that it has to. And we don't want any interruptions along the way, right? We want a smooth transfer of information. So once information, sensory input arrives at the spinal cord, it begins to ascend the spinal cord on its way to the brain. And this is where we have to look at the spinal cord itself. Now, peripheral nerve testing will give us some information about the spinal cord because we can look at specific peripheral nerves and we can understand where they originate. And so perhaps somebody tells us something about their history, like I've had a disc herniation, which is pretty common to hear from people. Whatever spinal cord injury, people might talk about, or maybe I've just had back pain for on and off for a long time. And when someone gives you that kind of a history finding, you have to be thinking about the spinal cord, because think about it as like a kink in the hose, right? We can't have a kink in the hose. So just a spinal cord mobility problem could actually interfere with incoming sensory input. And a lot of people have a history of spinal cord issues, or just in general, mobility problems of the spinal cord. So this actually builds a case for why just general practice of spinal cord mobility is actually a really healthy thing. The fitness industry is catching on, right, to needing a mobile spine. They don't talk about it in this way. They talk about it as, well, you got to be able to move your spine because the spine is designed to articulate, right, in a very sophisticated way, we might say. Well, to bring it, several steps further, because of those nerves originating in the spinal cord, and there's other nerves there too, like you mentioned, spinal cord or spinal nerves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything in the middle of the body, right? I mean, different
all your organs and all
your
that.
Organs, different areas of the trunk and the thorax, right? I mean, the middle of the body is where all the important stuff is, right? And that's important from a survival perspective. When the spinal cord doesn't move well, it's not a good thing. It's also very telling that what lives beneath it might not be as healthy as it could be, because you can actually have organ issues long term that develop or at least express themselves as tight muscles. We have reflexes or reflexive responses from when an organ is in some distress. that the muscles that surround that area and the connective tissues can also express that distress, which might lead to mobility issues in the midline of the body.
This is what you called like a referral, pain referral?
Well, yes. So there's pain referral, and then there's also these kind of visceral type reflexes that, along the same lines that as a pain referral, impact just mobility alone. Whether it's got to the point of being more nociceptive, where you feel pain, that's one thing. People are at least familiar with the idea that, one of the signs of somebody that's having a heart attack is it's left side, I believe, left side
Mhm.
pain of the radiating down the arm, right? That's what we mean with viscerally referred pain. And there are viscerally referred areas all along the midline of the body. And actually, it even extends out of the midline. And there's many philosophies on this and lots of connections. But the ones that we primarily think about are the midline ones. So, sort of a different topic altogether. But this idea that being able to move the middle of your body, and when we look at the joints that exist there, it's the spinal cord and the rib cage, need to be able to move. I mean, how about your spinal cord and its mobility and your rib cage and its mobility just for breathing,
Mhm.
right? If you can't move, if your ribs don't move well because of long-standing mobility issues of the spinal cord or just trunk, that's going to present some problems, right? If your breathing is impacted and you can't breathe optimally. And so back to kind of this idea that all sensory input coming in from the periphery is going to arrive at the spinal cord, begin to ascend up it on its way to the brain. We want to make sure the spinal cord's healthy from a mobility standpoint, for sure. We also have spinal cord reflexes, or what are referred to as deep tendon reflexes. We've talked a little bit about that in past episodes. That's when you're a kid and you're at the doctor's office, your legs on the table, the doctor bonks your knee with a reflex hammer and your leg jumps off the table by itself. Those reflexes, we have them all over the body with different muscles at these tendinous, junctions, where if you tap those tendon areas, there will be a reflexive response of the muscle. And that reflex is very much involving the spinal cord. It kind of works on an arc, like a big loop from that tendon all the way back to the spinal cord. And if the reflex doesn't work, or it is dysfunctional in a way that it is moving too much, right? You can have a reflex that is too responsive. You can have one that's non-responsive. We kind of want to strike a balance in the middle where the reflex works, but then after the limb moves, there might be a swing or two of the limb, but then it calms down. And when those reflexes are not working appropriately, it is technically telling us that there may be some integrity issues of the spinal cord.
Mhm.
So, for example, if you have a relatively serious spinal cord injury and you go to the doctor and you end up working with a neurologist or something, they will likely test your tendon reflexes to see, do they still work the way that they're supposed to? And that is because those reflexes are so involved with the spinal cord. So you could have old disc injuries that have impacted your tendon reflexes, and perhaps they don't work, anymore. And I've seen that quite a bit, actually. So moving on now, as we get closer to the brain, that sensory input is traveling towards the brain, and now we have the cerebellum. So we did a recent episode. What the heck was the name of it? Something about complex movement.
Yeah, complex movement training and the cerebellum.
Yeah. And we talked about this little brain that lives underneath the big brain and how one of its major roles is to help us with more complex types of movement tasks. Pretty interesting brain area. We spend a great deal of time talking about it and training it in our courses. There's different kind of subdivisions in our 8 levels of actually all of this stuff. The
Of course,
cerebellum,
yeah.
the cerebellum can be broken up into the spinocerebellum, the cerebrocerebellum, and the vestibulocerebellum. And those names have a lot to do with where certain anatomical areas are when we dive a little bit deeper. Like, for example, vestibulocerebellum. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the vestibular system and the cerebellum are essentially cross-talking a lot, right? And that the cerebellum is actually very much involved in similar qualities that the vestibular system helps us with, like balance, right? So, but for our purposes, be thinking about coordination, be thinking about accuracy of movement, be thinking about balance, right? And, when we test that, we test the cerebellum, we have a whole cerebellar flow of assessments that are kind of rhythm-based coordination assessments, like tapping your hand really fast or kind of doing a piano playing motion with your fingers to, as quickly as you can, or tapping your foot, or what we call hip pendulums, which is like a rapid internal external rotation of the hip. We have other assessments that kind of bring us a little bit closer to the midline of the cerebellum, where we're testing more balance, such as a Romberg style assessment, where you might set up your client in a narrow stance, feet together, and then have them close their eyes. Or you set them up in a tandem stance, which is one foot in front of the other, as if you're standing on a line, and then you have them close their eyes. The idea being, can you balance there for 20 to 30 seconds without any visual input? And what's happening posturally with sway? Our listeners can try that. If you get into a tandem stance, like you're standing on a line without cheating and rotating your feet out like a duck, you want them to be pointed forwards. You just stand upright, relax your arms, take a deep breath, and then kind of close your eyes and time yourself. Can you maintain your balance? And as a coach watching this happen, we'd be looking for different signs of postural sway, like swaying to the right or swaying to the left, maybe circular sway. They all tell us things about what might be happening with the cerebellum. So very, very important structure to consider for accuracy, balance, and coordination. Moving up from there, we are at the brainstem. Okay, we've talked quite a bit about the brainstem in past episodes. The brainstem is where all the reflexive stuff happens. It's kind of a very primitive subcortical, right? Subcortical region. We talk about the pontomedullary reticular formation. Okay, that's what we mean here. And this one is a huge target for us as movement coaches, because this is where reflexive stabilization comes from. This is where autonomics come from. You can think about blood pressure, even has a great deal to do with what's happening at the level of the brainstem. It's a big one. And for example, if you have a right ankle that seems to be chronically unstable because you've sprained it 10 times in the past, you've developed this kind of stability problem. Well, like we said, mechanically, like the fitness industry wants to say, well, maybe you need a stronger ankle. And you've done all the strength work, you've done all the mobility work, but your ankle still feels wobbly and not supporting you when you go hiking. Kind of jumping up this 8 levels, as we would kind of be looking at all these things, we might arrive at the brainstem and go, oh yeah, you know what? This is starting to look and sound like a reflexive stabilization problem. So perhaps we need to work at the level of the brainstem to work on that right ankle stability. Posture comes in here too. Brainstem is very much involved in global posture and muscle tone. So any posture issue, whether it's bilateral or unilateral, we'd be thinking about the brainstem for sure.
So, a question about anatomy. Thus far, we've been kind of working from the outside and in and up into the brain. So, from like the skin, tissue level to the peripheral nerve, into the
Hmm.
spine, up the spine, into the brain. This is where my anatomy gets really fuzzy, right?
Hmm.
Is is the brainstem, is the cerebellum between the spine and the brainstem?
The cerebellum is, so if you kind of think about that stereotypical image of the brain where you
Mm-hmm.
have the large cortex on top,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's where the lobes are, right? And we'll get to the lobes. Underneath that is another little brain. It almost resembles the same shape
Mm-hmm.
as the large cortex, but it's more compact and a little bit more, it's a little rounder,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the cerebellum. And if you were to move just, it's kind of across and down from there,
Mm-hmm.
you have the brainstem. Right, all these structures are relatively close to each other, but literally the stem, like the stem on a flower, right? You can think about like the flower portion is like the cortex, and literally the stem that is beneath that in this anatomy, it's the same, right? That's literally the brainstem.
So that's sort of what I'm wondering is, in my mind, the brainstem would come first in the order here if we're working our way in and up. I always
Yeah,
sort of imagine the brainstem sort of like attaching to the top of the spine almost
sure,
as it comes
sure.
up. So I'm just curious what the thought process is on the order from here on out now that we're in the brain, or
Yeah,
does it actually matter?
yeah. I yeah. I as far as that order goes, yeah, I don't have anything special to go. This is exactly why
Mhm.
that order is decided with this.
Mhm.
I mean, there's going to be, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, all of our movement, the pathways that exist for movement, a lot of them have to do with the brainstem as well.
Right.
So yeah, it's tricky because there's information going both directions, right? It's not only information going to the brain, right? So we've got like ascending information, then we've
Mhm.
got exiting information too,
Mhm.
right? So it's kind of a two-way street. Yeah. So there's going to be, stuff traveling in both directions in regard to the cerebellum and the brainstem. But yeah, again, I don't have like a perfect, like a good
Yeah.
explanation
I
of
was
being
just
like, oh, this is
curious of.
exactly why.
Yep. Yep.
So brainstem, think subcortical, think reflexive, and then we are now at the thalamus, again subcortical. So, and this is an interesting one. This is the thalamus is an area where so much information goes here. It's actually difficult to talk about it in some kind of isolated way because it does so much. But for the sake of our learning and the way that or the our ability to work with it in some ways, I'm going to describe it in a pretty simplistic way compared to what it actually does. But
Sure.
you can think about the thalamus as a switchboard operator between what is sometimes referred to as the old brain and the new brain. So old brain being like subcortical, new brain being the big cortex. Okay, people have different names for that. First brain, second brain. I think I've heard it as
Your lizard brain, I've
lizard
heard.
brain, and
Yeah.
then lizard brain, and what is the one to represent like executive functions? Lizard brain, and it's on the tip of my tongue. I'm not sure, but you get the idea,
Mhm.
right? So the lizard brain being like the subcortical stuff. So the thalamus acts as a switchboard operator between these two areas, subcortical and then what is cortical. And switchboard operator, meaning a lot of sensory input goes here, and then the thalamus is involved in the process of deciding how much of that sensory input is able to pass on to the cortex, because not all of it needs to, right? So there has to be some kind of filtering mechanism or switchboard operator to figure out what's important to allow to pass versus what is not. And this is where the conversation around pain becomes pretty interesting because nociception is essentially it's coming from the periphery or, the tissues, and it's not pain at that point, right? We don't have pain pathways. So what we have are pathways or nociceptive input that essentially is input that has been tagged with this idea that it could be dangerous, right? So the thalamus is involved in tagging it as potentially dangerous stimuli. And then we'll be involved in the process of saying, all right, I'm going to let this through. I'm going to let it go on to the cortex, or it doesn't really seem as that important. I'm going to squash it here so not as much moves on or none moves on to the cortex. And this is a big deal with pain because anything that moves on to the cortex then has more weight, I guess you might say, in terms of it becoming a pain experience. And so much is involved in pain, right? And the cortex will be heavily involved in constructing a pain experience. And gosh, so much. Your beliefs, cultural factors, upbringing, memory, what happened last time, your kind of predictions of what might happen in the future. I mean, it's endless. There's so many things, right? So imagine if all nociceptive input made it to the brain, because we're experiencing nociception all the time, constantly, actually. If all of it made it to the brain, that would not be good, right? We need the important things to make it to the brain, but we also have to have a good filter for it that kind of helps us understand what is appropriate, right? What is appropriate to have to allow through to potentially create a pain experience versus what isn't. And so this gets into some really interesting topics like thalamic conditioning, which is kind of a fancy way to say that anything that we do that is difficult, that has some level of discomfort that is associated with it, is thalamic conditioning. So if whatever you've learned in your lifetime that caused pain, maybe you're an endurance athlete and you push yourself to that red line, it's technically painful, right? If you've ever done something and your cardiovascular fitness is challenged as much as it can be, like that is also kind of a form of pain, right? Not pain like, ow, I hit my big toe with a hammer, but it's uncomfortable. And so is a lot of things that come from sports. Like we talked about jujitsu at the beginning of this episode. Jujitsu has a lot of nociception involved with it. I mean, people are creating enormous amounts of pressure on your abdomen, on your chest. They're torquing your joints. They're putting you in different submissions. There's pain that comes with that. And you could run so many types of sports through the filter and kind of be like, yeah, this one has a lot of nociception. And the point being is that your ability to deal with that and filter it at an appropriate level involves the thalamus, right? And your experiences leading up to that have a lot to do with it. Like if you try one of those sports for the first time and it causes you a lot of discomfort, you are more likely to quit if you don't have practice experiencing that discomfort. It's like if you've ever jumped in a cold plunge or something.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
There's people who are practiced at that, and there's people who are not practiced at that. And if you're not practiced at that, you're likely going to quit sooner than somebody who is practiced because they have trained their thalamus to understand what's okay, right? What's actually dangerous versus somebody who doesn't have that ability to filter it and understand it all yet, but they could with thalamic conditioning, which means do more of the thing that causes the discomfort and you will adapt to it, right? So there's a lot though with the thalamus. So pain's a big one there. Just overall sensory inputs. Typically like when we look at history with the thalamus, we might associate several different kinds of sensory deficits at this happening. Like let's say someone's leg, you test someone's leg and they're showing you very large areas where there is both a dorsal column and a spinal thalamic sensory loss, right? That means you found issues in both of the tracts that we assess. And it's contralateral, meaning opposite side of the body. That may be a history finding for the thalamus. A lot of sensory input will go to the thalamus. It even involves motor control. And an interesting one is like navigation challenges is something we think about with the thalamus, at least from a training perspective, because there's some level of like right-left discrimination that the thalamus is involved in. And you'll find that in the cortex too in certain areas. But so knowing your left, knowing your right, and navigation challenges because you have to essentially solve what in my mind is like a movement problem when you're navigating something. So think like an obstacle course.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have good right-left discrimination in order to create motor plans and understand them to navigate something that is challenging. Okay, so that kind of fits in there. So does overall coordination. We call it bone rhythm. So being able to, for example, squat without any coordination issues happening. We want the ankle, the knee, and the hip to share the load and help one another out with good quality coordination. And if there happens to be multiple large areas of the body that have some kind of sensory loss happening, which again might be that thalamic history finding, then something like squatting with good bone rhythm is going to be very, very difficult, because without the ability to sense, then we have what is simplified as a blurry map, right? It's a mapping problem. So interesting things to think about there. People who have had concussions, the thalamus is, I think it's hard for, I don't know if I'm going to use the right words, but it is susceptible, I guess, to some problems post concussion. Yeah. So chronic pain. Okay, this is probably the most important one for our listeners. Anyone who has been in chronic pain for a long period of time, and you can no longer associate it with tissue damage, right? Maybe there is no history of tissue trauma and you just have chronic pain. I mean, we see that all the time. Back pain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how many people out there have back pain with no back injury? Probably back pain is probably, maybe back and neck, right? Most of the time when people come to me and they describe back pain, neck pain, and we start getting into it, they don't have an injury mechanism for that. They're like, yeah, it just developed, right? And so that's chronic pain, right? Pain you've had for a long time. Well, thinking about what I had mentioned with the thalamus as being a switchboard operator, you actually can get better at experiencing chronic pain. And that's problematic. It's a survival mechanism, I guess you might say. So a lot of times people who have been in chronic pain for a long time have essentially become better at it. And their thalamus is kind of, call it sensitized in a way where that nociception that should be getting squashed or turned down is not. And instead, all the pain signaling, or I shouldn't even call it that, all the nociception is continuing on through. And these people also are very sensitive with pain issues. Like they do some stuff for a pain problem and maybe it feels better, but then they have an experience, whether they're conscious of it or not, because a lot of sensory input is unconscious. And the overwhelming amount of sensory input that arrives at the thalamus triggers it to go back to that hypersensitized state. And so now you've done something that actually helped you, but then you are kind of reset to being oversensitized again, and your pain comes back because maybe you've been dealing with thalamic issues for a long time. So your thalamus has become better at essentially letting pain through, which is not good, right? So that's a big one, and that's why the number one, like the first line tool for helping somebody with chronic pain is educating them about what chronic pain is and where it actually comes from. This will always be the best tool. And almost nobody in this world who's in chronic pain knows what pain is. Think about that. They don't know. Do you know how frightening that is? Right? That's why most people associate chronic pain with internal damage of some kind. And that's not how it works. You can't, just because you're in chronic pain, it does not mean you have problems. It doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you've got anatomy that's broken. It doesn't mean you have trauma. And that's why it's important to learn about what it is, where it comes from, because that alone is actually thalamic training. You just were educated about what pain is and where it comes from, and that can help kind of inhibit some of those responses that we talked about, which is why we're always encouraging our students to get comfortable with the pain education conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Because almost no one goes to physical therapy and learns what pain is. And when a doctor presents you with their opinion or an MRI, right? And you're there because something hurts. Nobody tells you what pain is and where it comes from. And nobody tells you that you could experience pain and not actually have damage. And, it's a rabbit hole of a conversation in itself. But the problem with that is it changes your thinking, right? It changes your thinking to kind of more catastrophizing the issue. Like, I must have that pain because I must have that problem. And sometimes that's not the case. So,
and that added stress and anxiety may also raise your threat levels globally
100%.
and create that pain or reinforce that pain.
Right. And the pain experience involves so many other things. Right. So that elevated level of stress certainly can help you be in pain longer.
Yeah. So we're at level 6, I believe.
Yeah. So we move. Yep. So 6. So yeah, exactly. So
yeah. And just real quick, a question. With the thalamus being the switchboard operator, right? And it's letting, nociception through or not. You might have something going on with the peripheral nerve. You might have an entrapment or something, and also have a thalamic issue.
Exactly.
That is either caused by it or reinforcing it. So at any point in these levels, like it's not necessarily, you might find a test that says, oh, this points to the thalamus, but it might not be definitive in that way. And vice versa. You might find something that says, oh, I think I've got something going on with this peripheral nerve, but that doesn't rule out that you also have a thalamic issue.
Exactly. Almost nobody has one problem. Right. So that's a good thing to bring up. And maybe after we go through these levels, because we're almost there now, we could run something through a filter to kind of help people understand that, like a pain issue. Right?
Fun. I love that.
Yeah. So next one here is the Insula. So we have an entire podcast episode technically on the Insula.
We've done so much.
Yeah, it's good. The Insula is the home of introception. Okay, and this idea of introception is actually getting popular now. There's been, there's a movement happening for sure. People are getting involved with learning about introception, which is basically your sense for your internal body. All right, is a way to describe it. Your body goes through a lot of functions. Your interpretation of what they mean requires you to have accurate interoception. So, for example, if your stomach growls, you know your stomach growled because you've learned that. And you have that interoceptive sense that helps you understand what it is and what does it mean. Okay. If you really concentrate really hard and maybe you interlock your fingers and you close your eyes and you just kind of body scan, most people, they have reasonably good interoception, can pick up on their pulse. right? It's actually a neat little exercise to do, and you can do it with different body areas. So I could say, okay, interlock your fingers, relax, breathe, focus your attention on your hands. Can you feel your pulse through your fingers? And then maybe we could bring our attention to a different body part, and you'll be amazed. You can get to a point where, as a person's introspection starts to increase in the moment from bringing more awareness to their internal body, as you go through this, people are like, oh my gosh, I can feel my heartbeat in my face. Right. And that's not something you're aware of when you're not focusing on it. Right. Breathing is the same. We are not aware of our breathing when we're just going about our daily tasks. At least we don't want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are, because their introspection has become sensitized to the point where they're focusing a lot on their internal body. This is very distracting for people. It's not fun when you are over aware of your own heartbeat. We see that people become over aware of certain areas in the midline of the body from usually long-standing insular issues. So if you're over aware of your breathing, some people are over aware of their core function. Some people are over aware of like their pelvic floor function. But on the other side of that coin is like a hypo awareness, like people having zero map for their core, zero map for their scapula, zero map for their pelvic floor function, right? Zero map for their breathing. Kind of goes both ways. But again, the point being, introspection has to do with basically the middle of the body, the internal, aspects of it. You could carry the conversation into organ function, because one of the cranial nerves that we talk a lot about in regard to introspection is the vagus nerve, which we have an episode on. And the vagus nerve is the nerve that is sending all of this interoceptive input to the insula, which I should say, I don't think I mentioned yet, is a part of the cortex. And if you think about the stereotypical image of the brain, you can't actually see the insular cortex because it is inside of that structure. So if you were to kind of peel back the temporal lobe and look at what's underneath it, you would then see the insular lobe, right? So kind of has not gotten the attention it deserves over the years because it's been hidden, and now is known as the fifth lobe, and people are talking a lot more about it now because it is so important for interoception.
I think it's so interesting that the part of the brain that is nested inside of itself is the part of the brain that is focused on understanding the sensations inside of your body.
Totally.
It's just really interesting how that worked.
The actual, the way the anatomy, where the anatomy lands in terms of its location and then what it does, it's always, there's so many interesting connections to that. The really interesting part about the insula, I mean, there's so many interesting things that it does, but the insular cortex essentially it's a home of it's like an information hub, really. There's visual input going there. There's auditory input. There's tactile sensory input going there, and even vestibular input goes there. And it's it's like an integration hub, and one of its primary roles is to tag things with emotional content, value, right? So when you are being touched, what does this mean on an emotional level? It also is involved in emotional and physical groundedness. So literally your stability, but also your emotional stability.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of interesting things.
Yeah, that is super interesting.
Yeah. It's so there's a very high emotional part, content with any any of the insular stuff, and it's a fascinating one. It's especially fascinating to train all the vagus nerve stuff that people are getting into, all the breathing stuff, even understanding sense of self better, asking yourself, how do I feel after a meal? right? Like really dialing into your own internal sense to kind of ask yourself, how do I feel right now? Some people are good at telling you how they feel. Some people are not good at it, right? It's the insula that's very much involved in distinguishing your emotions. So moving on now to the other lobes, right? We're kind of at the top. This is the 8th level, but it's divided up, right? Because there are 4 other lobes that haven't been discussed that just fall under the umbrella of the lobes. So we've got the occipital lobe, which is thought of as the home for visual processing, even though that's not entirely true, because there are so many brain areas that are involved in visual processing, but the occipital lobe is highlighted for that. Then there's the parietal lobe, which is usually highlighted as an area where sensory processing occurs and is involved in spatial awareness and orientation. So knowing where you are in space. For example, one of the history findings for the parietal lobe is, do you bump into things a lot? My wife is that person. She's like, how did I get this, like, she has a bruise. I forget on what side, but like she'll have a bruise on her hip, like all the time, just like comes and goes. She's like, I guess I bumped into stuff again. and that's a finding for the parietal lobe. So it's like spatial orientation. We then have the temporal lobe, which again, we zoom in, we say, okay, it does this, but it does so much. But the temporal lobe is known for like memory and sound processing. Like the auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. And the frontal lobe is next. The frontal lobe is one we talk about all the time because it is where voluntary movement is initiated from. And it is where your executive functions live, right? So attention and planning, all that stuff coming from the frontal lobe. So yeah, occipital, parietal, temporal, frontal. Okay, it's kind of at the top there. And that is the entire 8 levels. So let me just kind of list them out. So we started with receptor. We then went peripheral nerve, then spinal cord, then cerebellum, then the brainstem, the thalamus. So we're still subcortical, and now we're about to make the jump to the cortex, the insular cortex, followed by the lobes, occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal. And so every goal that you have, whether it's getting out of pain, improving quality of movement, or you are running a diagnosis that you have of a pain issue or something, whatever your goal is, you can run it through this filter, and the 8 levels becomes a thinking model that you can use to address the problem, because you might have different levels involved in the issue. Kind of like what you were getting at, Tony, where people can have more than one problem. Right. And that's important to know. You can have a pre-existing thing that is now kind of colliding with something else. And now what appears to be maybe one issue might not be, right? Because there's going to be other factors from, in terms of brain function, being affected by other things. So let's give people an idea, kind of running something through a filter here.
Yeah. I'm curious what your example problem might be.
Yeah, so let's just go like sciatica. People ask me about sciatica all the time. I think it's a good one because it's going to have the first 5 or so, at least 4 levels of the 8 levels are usually the easiest for people to understand at first, because they can kind of visualize it better, especially if our listeners don't yet have experience like with some of these other neuro tools. At least receptor, peripheral nerve, spinal cord makes a lot of sense if you're still sort of thinking mechanically.
Yeah.
But then we got to make the jump to thinking more neurologically, right, with global function, as we start to get into the cerebellum, the brainstem, the thalamus, and the lobes. But you can imagine this. So let's say the client has sciatica and they're complaining of left side, symptoms, radiating discomfort. down the glute region, maybe into the hamstrings, all the way down to the calves or even the bottom surface of the foot. If we're calling that sciatica, we would run that through the 8 levels filter and immediately go, okay, you got to ask yourself questions, right? So think about that first receptor category. You could ask yourself, is there a problem with sensation? That's the first question you would ask yourself with somebody who has sciatica. And you only know the answer to that by talking to them and asking them questions, and then by following up with sensory testing. Otherwise, you don't know the answer to that. So you might say to the person, hey, do you have sensation issues? And they might go, well, I don't know. What would that feel like? Do you have any hypersensitivity on that side of your body? Well, they might say, well, yeah, my pain. Okay. Well, that is technically a sensation issue. Do you have any sensation issues like when you put your sock on? They're like, no, not that I notice. Well, you still have to test. So that's when you run your sensory tests. Now, if you're thinking about, well, where do I run the test? This person is telling me they have pain from their glutes all the way down to their foot. Well, you might then use your 8 levels model again and go, well, let me start with the foot with sensory testing, particularly the bottom of the foot, because I'm starting to think about the sciatic nerve and the tibial branch,
right,
based on where they're having their symptoms. So you do sensory testing on different areas associated with the tibial nerve. So different skin areas, which would be the bottom surface of the foot, also the heel, and some of the gastroc. And so you might do your sensory test and you might go, oh, that's weird. Or actually, that's not weird. You might go, that's exactly what I expected.
Yeah.
They actually have a problem sensing vibration, let's say, on their left calf and their left heel compared to the right. And so in your notes, you're writing down sensory loss, dorsal column sensation, vibration. And that's important to know because that's a sensory problem. Now, there are now consequences to having a sensory problem. And those consequences are the next 7 levels. Because think about information traveling the levels, eventually arriving at the cortex. So is it a receptor problem primarily? We don't really know. So we still have to consider the next 7 levels. So then in your thinking, you might go, okay, I found an area where they have a known sensory deficit, but I still have to think about the peripheral nerve because they're telling me they have sciatic-like symptoms. So I'm thinking that tibial branch, I'm thinking, the trunk of the sciatic nerve. And maybe I took a history, or I definitely took a history. That's important. And in a conversation, you learned that they actually do have a pre-existing sacral injury from whenever. And maybe they tell you what that is. And you go, oh, okay. I definitely have to test the nerve because of where it originates. They've actually had a problem there.
Mm-hmm.
We'll come back to that because as we continue up, what's that? Well, that's the spinal cord. Okay, so tracing it back, I'm testing now the peripheral nerves that I might be concerned with. I've got lots of tools to do that. Sensation is one of them. Our neuromechanic exercises is another form. So all the tensioning, slacking, sliding of nerves, right? I've got to figure out, is this nerve having difficulty moving, right? You get the idea. Maybe there's an entrapment. Maybe it's just become kind of hypersensitized from the pain issue for so long. But maybe actually I got to continue my thinking because maybe it's actually primarily a spinal cord issue, right? And so we're climbing the ladder here. Is there any issues with the spinal cord? So I got the history that there is. And now I'm going to test mobility. Just starting out really simple. Can this person move their spine? Can they move their pelvis? What is their sacrum doing when they walk, right? From a mobility perspective, I've got to consider that. And I might also do some sensory testing in that area. And I might even test deep tendon reflexes, right? So now I'm back kind of working distally where I'm tapping a tendon hammer on their Achilles. Or their hamstrings? Do their tendon reflexes work? Yes or no? Right? Those are all things running through my head when I arrive at the spinal cord level in our thinking. And as we continue up, right, we get to the cerebellum. Well, this person's been in pain for a long time. They've had a history of a spinal cord issue. Do you think their coordination has been affected? Yeah, because they've moved differently for a long period of time. The consequence to moving differently or not as much at all could be that you now have a cerebellar deficit because you're not doing as much movement with that side. And you're not doing as much complicated movement with that side. You have what's called now an input problem, if you know what I mean, because you're moving less. So maybe we find that using some of our cerebellar training through our joint mobilizations, which are complex, nonlinear in nature, meaning they're circular, right? Those are great ways to train the cerebellum. Maybe we find that you need some of that work along the lower body, knee circles and ankle tilts and, different mobility drills for the foot, whatever it might be, the hip, the spine, right? We might have to do pelvic tilt series and learn how to, move those areas better. And all that could be, you could think about it as not only just general proprioceptive work, but cerebellar training. And continuing up with the brainstem, there could be brainstem consequences to this input problem. There could be stability issues. There could be muscle tone issues. I should have said that too for the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is involved in muscle tone, particularly like midline and proximal muscle tone, particularly extensors. So with like sciatica, people are going to be telling you about their hamstrings and their gastrocs. And a lot of times people develop atrophy in those muscles and weakness. And again, we might think cerebellum, but we might also think the brainstem because of its role in stability and its role in muscle tone. Moving up, thinking about the thalamus, chronic pain for a long time, right? Maybe an oversensitized issue. Maybe this person has learned to live with sciatica for a long period of time, right? And they've just gotten better at it. And they've actually reorganized their thinking around their pain issue. People do this all the time, right? They've been in pain for a long time and they start to believe they're fragile. You don't want to believe you're fragile because if you believe you're fragile, you are. That's literally what it comes down to. So being in pain for a long time changes us psychologically, and whatever story we tell ourselves is what we end up believing, right? So that thalamic conditioning piece where you need to learn about what pain is, where does it come from, right? That's really important. And then through a training process, you are essentially teaching the thalamus what is safe and what is not. That's kind of the training process there, which is super important. So perhaps we are adding different types of sensation to the mobility drills. Maybe it's even multiple sensations at once. Sometimes we have to take a sensation that is perceived as very safe and stack it with one that is not. So someone has trouble moving their knee because they've been in pain for a long time. We vibrate the knee, but we also put a cold pack on it. Or we put a cold pack on the calf. We put vibration on the knee, right? And we're using kind of dual sensations. Sometimes this can be very effective for training that needs to happen at the thalamic level. And we're working on coordination of the movement itself. So and we're educating them, right? There's that thalamic piece. So yeah, all that, thinking like that with the thalamus, and then, the main question there being like issues with long-term chronic pain. Does this person have a history, right? Moving up to the insula. So this is interesting. I mean, like we talked about, you can have other issues that are involved. I mean, I could have given another issue example for all of these levels, but the insula is a good one because, like, for example, let's imagine that the same person who's experiencing sciatica is also telling you in a history that they've had long-standing gut issues, whatever that might be, digestive sensitivities, difficulties just digesting certain foods make them sensitized, or maybe they just know they have like a diagnosed like gut issue. They're working on their gut health. There's so many things there. Those types of internal threats will create internal threat, right? And the insula could be involved now. And remember, the insula helps tag different sensory inputs with emotion. And let's say you have some pre-existing internal health issues like gut issues that can actually exacerbate other things. And sciatica is actually a good example of that because of where the nerve roots come from at the level of the sacrum. A lot of times you can have like gut sensitivities or gut inflammation that increases symptoms simply because of things living close to each other and sharing nociception and kind of similar to that conversation we had on like viscerally referred pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So maybe there's a pre-existing internal threat that's now actually kind of helping to exacerbate an issue and make it more chronic and keep it sticking around for longer. So an example of that is, can we work on the insula? Can we work on these gut issues by, yes, targeting the insula, but also doing what we need to do for gut health? And might we see sciatic symptoms decrease because of that? And that's absolutely a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there's a lot of ways to kind of take it as far as how would the insular cortex be involved, but that's one idea. And then as we go up into the remaining lobes, I mean, there's so many ways you could take this. Let's say someone has a pre-existing hearing problem. Okay, they've had hearing issue on one side their whole life. So we're talking about left-sided sciatica. Let's say that we found a lot of stability issues on that side of the body. And then the person in history says, yeah, I actually don't have good hearing on my left side. And if you know your cranial nerves and you're kind of thinking about your pathways, you might immediately go, oh, interesting. I should consider that because I know that if I can do some stuff to stimulate the cochlear nerve through sound stimulus or even vestibular stimulus on that side of the body, I can affect muscle tone on that side of the body. So that's an example of another pre-existing thing that could then be also kind of wrapped up in some of the tone issues that someone might be having on that side of the body. So, yeah, maybe we're now bringing in other aspects of training these systems to affect the one that we are most focused on. That would also kind of bring our attention to like the temporal lobe because of the auditory processing component. Man, we could essentially affect muscle tone by working with those other lobes too. I mean,
vision drills.
We go vision for the occipital lobe. We go other types of sensory processing for the parietal lobe. We could go just general movement, but also working in cognitive loads for the frontal lobe. There's so many things, right? And this is just where it gets cool because it's like, oh, neurology really does show you holistic health, right? And it takes the woo-woo out of like, well, you have sciatica and you're pointing to the burning pain in your calf, but we might actually do something with your eyes or your sound processing that could impact that, right? Which is wild, but that's what applied neuro is. You're thinking about all systems and you're testing them to see like what is their influence on this thing. So yeah, there's so many other tools, right, that we didn't even talk about, but it's a different conversation, right? Because you've got this 8 levels and then you've got these subcategories of each of the 8 levels. Right. But then you've also got your toolbox. And your toolbox can be divided up so that you understand your tools and where they fit in terms of the 8 levels. And sometimes there's overlap, like a vestibular drill, right? A vestibular drill is going to be stimulating for cranial nerve 8. Well, as soon as we stimulate cranial nerve 8, we're now talking about the brainstem because that's where it originates. But a vestibular system also speaks to, or a vestibular drill also speaks to the cerebellum, right? So we can affect the cerebellum through that. And so there's a lot of carryover, right? A lot of kind of crossover with the tools. And, some of our tools are like maybe more targeted towards a specific area, and others are kind of more broad. It's really neat to think about it that way.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear this framework. I feel like it's almost a culmination of 2 years of podcasting. It's
Yeah.
like we've talked so much about the tools and about specific brain areas, or it's like we've done kind of a lot of the more siloed aspects of it.
Right.
And so this to me is so powerful, because it's how do we apply all of that knowledge in a systematic way, so that
That's
when
it.
you encounter a problem, you're not lost and you're not just throwing stuff at the wall, which, you can get there that way too, right?
Yeah.
But this will speed you up, because now you're thinking,
Yep.
from in to out, from out to in, what are the different things that could be affecting this sciatic problem?
Yeah, this is also a really good thinking model to have when you run into challenges, like just tricky clients where you've done some good stuff, but you feel like you're falling short. Many times I've just had to take a step back from thinking about what I'm doing with a client, and really literally write down the 8 levels, and
Mhm.
sort of just start jotting down some history things that kind of go with each of the levels, and then ask myself those questions like, okay, have I worked enough with peripheral nerves? Have I
Mhm.
really evaluated their spinal cord thoroughly? Have I evaluated these receptors thoroughly? Am I missing a body area? Am I missing certain sensations? Because you can't do it all at once. You never can. If you tested a client and did everything we know how to do, you would never actually get to training,
Right.
because there's so many things, and you have to be careful of that early on when you're learning this stuff, because the tendency is to want to do all the sophisticated stuff.
Mhm.
I always tell people, because this comes up a lot in our community, they're like, man, there's so many options. What do I do? And I'm like, yes, there are. And, that's okay. Always revert back to movement, right? Always go back to movement as a starting point, because you can get so much done with that. And then as you begin to kind of pick your levels that you're going to assess, you can only do so much at once.
Yeah.
So you might decide, like with a client in a session, you're going to do some sensory testing on their feet, right? And you're going to also look at some neuromechanics for peripheral nerves. And that's all you have time for in that
Mhm.
moment. And that's where it begins. And then you kind of see where that takes you and how they're assessing. And then that might then prompt you to think about other levels as you work through it.
Yeah. This also seems to me like a great framework to revisit when considering stacking.
Big time.
When we've talked about stacking before, it always seems kind of like, oh, we've got a clue that points to this and a clue that points to that.
Yes.
Well, now you can take these 8 levels and say, okay, well, I have a clue that points to one thing. Let me look at the other levels and see if there's
Exactly.
something else that might coincide, and you can try to design a stack based on that. That's
I,
really
I
cool.
I find myself doing that a lot. Actually, that's a good thought, and I also use it sometimes. Again, trying to be more time efficient because you can't do it all. I sometimes will think about what drills have given me the best results with somebody,
Mhm.
and I will use that to lead me into the 8 levels. Like sometimes I'm doing this stuff, and then I have to take a step back and I go, well, what have I actually done? And I start kind of jotting it down, and I'm like, wow, I've actually done a lot of work in the frontal lobe. And they
Didn't even
continue.
think about it that
Yeah,
way, though. Yeah.
I didn't think about it that way. And I have like all this stuff listed that kind of falls into the frontal lobe category of training. And I might say to myself, man, they assess so well to frontal lobe stimulus. And that's important for me to know, so I can give myself permission to keep going with that. I can also use it for improving underperforming systems. So once I kind of know what they're already good at, and what they're, well, maybe it's what they're already good at, but it's also what are they assessing really well with, I can lean on that. And then maybe I find other areas where they're more challenged and they seem to have more issues, and I'm building a stack, like you said, I can take what's good and I can stack it with what's bad. And that is a really good tactic for, re-education for the brain and the nervous system and reducing threat while you deliver what is technically a threatening stimulus and teach somebody how to deal with it better. So it's cool, like how many different directions you can come from with the 8 levels.
Yeah. I feel like this is the kind of episode I would want to listen to more than once.
Yeah, and I think I know some of our students will listen to it multiple times. I'm kind of excited to see what they think of it, because we don't really get a chance to break it down like this, right? For an hour and a half on the 8 levels. It sort of comes up in little chunks within our conversations, within our curriculum. So this is going to be good.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Any final thoughts on the 8 levels, maybe, and on applying the 8 levels yourself, perhaps?
Just to, let people know that, there's a lot, as you heard and experienced, there's a lot more to any issue than just the mechanical nature of it. This model, or this thinking model, does not throw biomechanics out. We'll never throw that out, but instead it makes biomechanics neurobiomechanics. And so if you're a health and movement professional that is really interested in building your skill set and really understanding holistic health and how everything sort of fits together, this is a great model to do it. This is the best model that I have found, and it continues to help me advance past that just typical, stereotypical thinking about a pain issue just being mechanical. And just allows you to really flow through the different levels and understand your tool set better. Because I feel like there's a lot of practitioners out there that do great work and they still don't even understand the mechanisms of why the things that they're doing that do work, why they're actually working. Because you have to understand the 8 levels to be able to run the techniques through those filters. And then once you do that, it helps you do even greater things with the tool sets that you have. Right. And then, of course, if you want to even build the tool set out and understand more of the neuro tools that we're teaching, then you can just get involved in our courses, which I should mention at this point, people should know that we do not have, at least I'm saying this with 90% certainty anyway, we don't have any public enrollments happening for the rest of this year, for 2026. And what that means, public, is that you're not going to see me on Instagram or YouTube or something saying, hey, by the way, we have an enrollment coming and you can get involved in it. But we will have private enrollment. And if you are interested in getting involved in our courses, we will be running private enrollments, but it is critical that you guys get on our email list so that you can know about those private enrollments when they happen. So if you are in fact interested, make sure that you get on the email list, and you can actually go to our website or visit the link, in the show notes to put yourself on the wait list for the courses. And then in doing that, you will get emails when we do an enrollment. And we are considering the idea of actually doing a private email list only enrollment in May. So keep that in your back pocket if you're excited to get involved.
Awesome.
All right. Well, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. This has been one we've been talking about for a bit, or we knew we had to do it, and well, here it is. And I like it. I'm glad. I like where it went, and we'll be able to talk more about the 8 levels in the future. And now that our listeners will kind of have this under their belt, I think it's going to help you understand some of the previous episodes that we've done, and at least think about them in a different way. Maybe even go back and listen to some of them and experience them in a little bit different way using this framework or model. Thanks everybody for listening. We will be back soon.